To be told that your body is a ticking time bomb was terrifying.
It's just an awful feeling, knowing at any moment she could lose her life.
I thought my husband was having a seizure right in front of us.
I realized my whole body was paralyzed.
Next, two medical mysteries that defy the experts. When Jessica Blazak wakes up with a sky-high fever, she suddenly finds herself facing a terrifying disease that no doctor knows how to stop.
The whole thing was just surreal to me. I was very scared. I felt I pretty much could die any minute.
Then, David Skinner is suddenly forced to face a terrifying reality. He can't feel his legs. And no doctor can tell him why.
I was panicked. Am I ever going to be able to walk again? What kind of father, what kind of husband will I be?
When illness strikes, we look to doctors to give us answers. But what if they can't? For these unlucky patients, diagnosis is a mystery.
In the spring of 1999, 22-year-old Jessica Waxman was enjoying single life and her career as a freelance writer. And when she met health policy analyst Dave Blazak at a Baltimore nightclub, sparks flew.
Dave was really cute. He was charming, he was funny, and I could just tell right away he was a good guy.
I was attracted to her, and she seemed really nice, and we hit it off from there.
Dave and Jessica date for the next 5 years. And in the fall of 2004, they get married. Soon after, they settle into a new home. The newlyweds couldn't be any happier.
We like going out to parks, hanging out with our dog, just doing a lot of stuff outside. Jessica was always in good health. She never had any type of sickness.
But then, one day in June of 2006, Jessica finds herself under the weather.
I just felt unbelievably tired. I started to get really cold to the point where I was shivering. I'd had the chills. I just thought, well, you know what? I probably have the flu. So I decided to just take some over-the-counter painkillers and just sleep it off.
I became concerned when I arrived home after work. When I checked her temperature, she had a 105 fever. It seemed dangerously high. And I thought, we definitely need to go to the hospital.
They let us in right away. They told me I was severely dehydrated. And they gave me an IV. They just did basic tests and just thought I had a virus.
They gave her over-the-counter fever-reducing medicine, and the fever went down and sent her on her way.
I actually felt a little relieved that they thought it was nothing. But that night, the fevers came back.
And over the next few days, her temperature continues to fluctuate. Jessica grows increasingly worried that she's been hit by something far more dangerous than a simple virus.
I had a general feeling of nausea and just overwhelming sickness and fever. I probably had about 101 fever when I woke up. Around 3 or 4 o'clock in the afternoon, they would spike. They would go all the way up to 104. And it was scary.
We tried over-the-counter fever-reducing medicine, but the fever kept coming back and nothing was improving.
I called the doctor, and he said that I needed to just try to let it run its course, and I would feel better.
Exhausted from the constant temperature shifts, Jessica does her best to work whenever her fever is down. But it isn't long before a disturbing new symptom sets in.
I got a very bad headache. If you can picture worse than a migraine, this was it. A searing pain. In the front of my head and in the back of my head and over my eyes. And all I see is kind of like when somebody takes a picture, you see the flashes.
I've never seen Jessica this sick before, and I felt that we had to do something.
He said to me, "You need to go back to the hospital."
I rushed her straight to the ER.
When we got to the emergency room, they could see that I was just in unbelievable amounts of pain. Because I was having headaches, they performed a lot of scans. They performed CTs. They performed x-rays. Every single test came back negative.
And then they put her on high doses of IV antibiotics, just in case she had a bacteria or virus in her body.
I was very frustrated at this point. I thought, am I gonna figure out what's wrong with me?
12 hours later, the medical team begins to suspect that Jessica has meningitis, an inflammation of the protective membranes that cover the spinal cord. It can be caused by a virus or bacteria and may be fatal.
Meningitis was considered a possibility because of the headaches and the fever. This was the first time that I thought, oh my God, I could have something really serious.
The thought of her possibly having meningitis was very unsettling to us and upsetting. They wanted to perform a spinal tap to find out if she definitely had meningitis.
The whole thing was just surreal to me. I was very scared.
We had to wait several hours for the results from the doctor. It was very nerve-wracking. I was very worried, but it was negative, and it was a big relief that she didn't have meningitis. But it felt like we were back to square one and didn't know what was wrong with her.
The antibiotic was helping. The fever was still there, but it wasn't as bad. I think it was probably around 101, and my headaches were gone. So they said, okay, well, you're stable. You seem to be getting better. We'll send you home. I was pretty frustrated at that point. I knew I needed a second opinion. I saw an infectious disease doctor 2 days after our hospital visit.
Jessica walks her through everything she's experienced over the past 3 weeks. And after performing a thorough exam, the doctor comes to a startling conclusion.
It was very surprising to me. They thought I had leptospirosis.
Leptospirosis is a rare infection caused by Leptospira, a bacteria found in fresh water that's been contaminated by animal urine.
Leptospirosis did make sense, because Dave and I did go kayaking a couple weeks before I got sick.
The doctor immediately orders a blood test. And 3 tense hours later, the findings come in negative for leptospirosis. Baffled, she consults with her team, and soon after suggests an even more alarming possibility.
She thought it might be cancer. And that's when things got really scary.
Some of her symptoms did match up with non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. She was having night sweats. She had spikes in the fever.
My mom passed away from non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. So it brought back a whole lot of memories that were very unpleasant.
The fact that cancer is now a possibility terrified us.
In the fall of 2006, 42-year-old David Skinner and his wife Janice were celebrating their 13th wedding anniversary and more in love than ever. Their house was full of joy and laughter, despite the fact that their 2 children had their share of medical problems.
At the time, Justin was 11 years old and Sarah was 7 years old. Both children were born with a congenital defect. Justin lives with spina bifida.
My spine is formed outside my body. Because of my condition, I walk with crutches, and for long distances, I use my wheelchair.
Sarah was born in 1999 with a congenital heart defect.
I have to take medicine every day, and like every morning and every night.
Ever since Justin's been born, we've dealt with medical issues with the kids, so life was hectic. But Dave and I, we've always prided ourselves on working well as a team.
We were living in Dayton, Ohio. I was a data analyst, and Janice was a customer service representative for an insurance company. We managed our schedule as best we could, and we thought this was how life was going to be. We didn't expect anything else.
Juggling very busy schedules comes easily for Janice and David. They even managed to find time to stay fit. The young parents know their children rely on them, and staying healthy is a priority.
Aside from taking cholesterol medication, I was in perfect health. I was physically active and able to do whatever I wanted to do.
And that November, David is just as active as ever.
We were outside picking up the sticks and doing some other yard work to get ready for the winter. I was doing a lot of bending over, didn't think anything of it. I woke up the following morning and I felt like my legs were not a part of my body. I didn't hurt at all, but I couldn't stand up straight. My knees were bent at a 90-degree angle. I was panicked, so I screamed for Janice to come help me.
He couldn't even walk down the hallway. He was very weak and he didn't understand what was going on.
Alarmed, Janice rushes David to the closest emergency room.
The doctor came in and asked me to stand up, but I crumpled to the floor. So at this point, I couldn't even stand up or walk. It seemed that the condition was progressing. And the doctor mentioned that it could be Guillain-Barré syndrome.
Guillain-Barré syndrome is an autoimmune disease that attacks the nerves, causing muscle weakness and, in severe cases, complete paralysis.
So they did a blood test to see if, in fact, that was the case. About 3 hours later, the results were in, and it was not Guillain-Barré. The doctor said, "We don't know what's going on with you, but we're going to admit you and do more testing." Every day, the doctors came in, ordered more tests. They did a CAT scan, an MRI, an EMG, and all the results for those came back negative. The doctors were stumped. I'm laying there thinking, am I ever going to be able to walk again? What kind of father, what kind of husband will I be? I felt I was letting my family down.
Then, on his 5th day in the hospital, David wakes up to find his condition has taken a sudden, unexpected turn for the better.
I was able to stand and get up out of bed and walk about 75 feet with a walker. So I was wondering, why can I walk today when I couldn't walk yesterday? The doctors couldn't figure out what was going on, so they decided to send me to inpatient rehabilitation to get better. And I believed that I needed to push myself because the doctors said I would get stronger if I did that.
But in rehab, David's mysterious illness once again takes a baffling turn.
The first day I was able to stand for 20 minutes. And then the third day I could only stand for 30 seconds. And I couldn't understand why I was losing the strength when I was working so hard.
It all didn't add up. He would start to fall like he was back to where he started.
Perplexed by the turn of events, the neurologist begins investigating potential causes and concludes that the answer is actually very simple. David's relapse is a side effect of his cholesterol medication.
I mentioned to him that I'd been taking it for a year and a half, and he said, well, your body could have used it appropriately for a period of time, and then the weakness could have just started even after being on it that long. The doctor took me off the cholesterol medication, discharged me from the inpatient therapy, and sent me home with a walker.
We were thinking once the medication got out of his system, everything would be back to normal, he'd be back to walking, and he'd be stronger again.
Every day, I woke up wondering if I'll be able to walk, but I still couldn't stand up without great difficulty, and I would have to use the walker to get around.
But his physical limitations aren't the only thing weighing David down.
I had to go on short-term disability through work, and I needed to go back to work. My worst fear was wondering if we would be able to keep our house if I couldn't work at all, because I was the primary breadwinner, and wondering how much debt we were going to get in. I followed up with the doctor a couple of times, and the doctor would say, well, we just have to wait for your body to accept the removal of that medication, and it'll take some time.
But as David does his best to stay optimistic, a frightening new symptom strikes without any warning.
It was Monday afternoon. We were laughing, having a good time, playing cards.
It was his turn, and he was reaching for the deck of cards. And then he just started shaking full body. The cards went everywhere. His head was just bobbing up and down really quickly, and his hands were shaking.
I thought my husband was having a seizure right in front of us.
I had no idea what was happening to me.
Over the past 3 weeks, 30-year-old Jessica Blazak has been suffering from extremely high fevers and overwhelming fatigue. Despite performing multiple tests, her doctors aren't sure what's going on. But now, one specialist has dropped a bombshell. Jessica may have cancer.
They did a blood test to see her white blood cell count. Also, they did a full body PET scan that would highlight if there was any type of cancerous tumors within her body.
They give you an IV. It's a radioactive fluid that courses through your veins, and then they just scan your body. And after the test, you're so scared to hear the results.
It was absolutely agonizing, and we couldn't wait till the actual results came back.
We talked about how this could affect us, what could happen if I did have cancer, you know, what we would do, and we deal day by day with what happens. They let me know the next day that I did not have cancer.
To hear that was an absolute relief.
It was a huge weight off my shoulders, huge.
But we were very frustrated that we weren't getting any answers and nobody could figure out why she is having these type of symptoms.
As the days went on, I felt worse. I had muscle aches, the constant feeling of sickness, of nausea, of weakness. I felt I couldn't catch my breath sometimes.
Even worse, her temperature keeps fluctuating.
When the fever would spike to 105, I would get super cold. And I'd have to just go under the covers and try to just get warm again. And then when my fever would break, I would get very hot. So it was a cycle.
The fever was taking a toll on her daily activities, and she was spending a lot of time in bed, sweating and bundled up.
You feel helpless. You feel like there's nothing you can do. After having 105 fevers every day, it gets to the point where, like, you're thinking, geez, am I gonna wake up tomorrow? It's just really scary.
Desperate to help Jessica, Dave devotes himself to researching doctors and soon comes across a highly respected internist he thinks his wife should meet, Dr. Abby Mae Miller.
Jessica first went to see Dr. Miller about 3 weeks after she was released from the hospital.
When I went to see Dr. Miller, my fever was probably around 104. I ran a fever all day long.
I've never seen a patient with such a persistent fever before. The fever itself isn't so dangerous, but most of the causes for a fever that persists can be dangerous. So I wanted to repeat her blood cultures.
But the findings shake Jessica to the core.
A couple days later, I got a call from Dr. Miller. She goes, this could be very serious. You have bacteria in your blood.
Bacteria in the blood can cause a syndrome called sepsis. And Jessica ended up septic. So I recommended that she go immediately to the emergency room.
Sepsis is a serious bacterial infection in the bloodstream. If left untreated, it can result in death.
I was pretty freaked out. We didn't really know how to feel, but we knew that whatever we had to do, it needed to be done fast. When I was rushing to the hospital, it was surreal. Dr. Miller met us at the hospital. We were admitted immediately. They treated me with high doses of antibiotics, very high doses. As soon as I got on the antibiotics, my fever was reduced, 101, as opposed to 104.
But while Dr. Miller tries to get the life-threatening sepsis under control, she finds herself grappling with an entirely new problem.
I did another physical exam, and she had a very loud heart murmur. And that was different than previous exams. It can be associated with some serious heart problems.
A heart murmur is an irregularity in the heartbeat. It can be a sign of infection, disease, or valve problem, any of which can prove fatal.
That was a big shock to us.
I was like, what? A heart condition? Nobody's even mentioned anything like that. It was terrifying. I pretty much could die any minute.
Over the last month, David Skinner has been suffering from an inexplicable, debilitating condition. His muscles are so weak, he can barely walk. And now, Out of the blue, he finds his entire body jerking violently out of control.
The shaking lasted about a minute before he finally stopped. At this point, we didn't know what was going on, so I rushed him to the emergency room. The doctor assessed him and took the family history, found out about Justin and Sarah, and automatically said he had a stressful lifestyle. He had 2 kids with disabilities, therefore it's got to be stress.
The doctor explains that stress can trigger the production of cortisol, which in turn raises the level of a chemical that helps make muscles move.
He prescribed an anti-anxiety medication, and he wanted me to go see a therapist. I figured the doctor knew what he was talking about. Maybe this is the case, so this is what I need to do to get better.
Over the next 2 months, Dave stayed with the anti-anxiety medicine, but that would just make him really sleepy all the time. So that wasn't helping either. He still was weak. It just all didn't add up.
I didn't improve at all. Nothing changed. I would have a shaking episode at least once a day. I could barely walk. My legs would just feel so extremely weak, like I had run for 100 miles.
There were some days that he stayed in the recliner and he was just too weak to really even get up or do anything.
Over the next 2 months, David's muscles seemed to lose strength with every passing day. And by March, his legs are so weak, he begins using a wheelchair part of the time.
Some days I could walk with the walker and I would walk very slowly. The next day I might have to use the wheelchair all day. Every day seemed different.
I just ended up taking on Dave's role, my role, whatever physically needed to be done. It was really hard, but I didn't have a choice.
I stopped being the husband that she had married and started being someone that was making life more difficult for her than it should be.
Desperate to get his life back, David schedules an appointment with a brand new neurologist.
The doctor comes in and examines me, does a neurological workup, and thought that it might be multiple sclerosis and decided to order an MRI.
Multiple sclerosis, or MS, is a disease in which the nerves of the brain and spinal cord become damaged and lose their ability to control the body's muscles.
I thought the MRI would give me some answers, but the results of the MRI were negative.
That was frustrating. At this point, you start to wonder, are we ever going to have an answer?
To make matters worse, David increasingly feels the pressure of mounting bills.
3 months after my first symptoms occurred, my short-term disability was running out. So I needed to go back to work. We needed to make sure that we would be able to keep our house. I used the wheelchair at work because there were some longer distances that I had to travel. Life in a wheelchair is different. People look at you differently. It was really hard for me. I didn't feel whole, and using the wheelchair didn't help that in any way.
Determined to get to the bottom of his strange condition, David seeks out second opinions.
I went to 2 different specialists to see what was going on, and both those doctors also said it was stress. I was angry and frustrated because I didn't feel like the doctors were really listening to me.
It was hard to see him this week. I've got the 2 kids with disabilities, and then who knows what Dave has, so it's a lot to take on.
For nearly a year, this was how life was, and I started to come to terms with the fact that this is how life is going to be for me.
But just when David feels he's made peace with his incapacitating illness, he finds himself facing his worst fear.
I was home alone with the kids. I was in the kitchen. I was using my walker. As I was returning to the living room, almost immediate weakness hit my body. I fell to the ground, and I tried to move my arms. I tried to move my legs. I tried to move my head, and nothing would move. At that point, I realized my whole body was paralyzed.
Jessica Blazak is in a horrifying state. She just learned that she's septic. A deadly bacteria is coursing through her body. And 2 hours after being admitted to the hospital, her doctor has discovered that she has a dangerous heart murmur. Now, cardiologist Dr. Michael Notarianni has taken over her case.
When I first met Jessica, she was very sick. Once bacteria is in the bloodstream, it's important to look at everywhere where you could possibly have infections. Certainly the heart is one of the areas where infections can hide.
Dr. Notarianni thinks he may know what's behind Jessica's mysterious decline. But to confirm his hunch, he needs to get a clear look at her heart.
A TE is a transesophageal echocardiogram, where we place an ultrasound probe at the end of a tube. That tube is then inserted into the esophagus and brought down to the stomach and to the level of the heart so that we can see the heart a lot more close up. The transesophageal echocardiogram confirmed the diagnosis of endocarditis.
Endocarditis is a life-threatening infection of the heart. In a healthy individual, when bacteria enters the bloodstream, the immune system fights it off. But in patients like Jessica, for unknown reasons, bacteria lodges on the valves in their heart. Blood then clots around the bacteria, forming a dense growth that antibiotics can't reach, which can lead to both sepsis and potentially fatal damage to the heart.
Once the vegetation is formed, the heart valve can then not open and close correctly. In addition, it can just start to destroy the actual structure of the valve, so that the valve itself does not work the way it's supposed to work.
I was completely floored, but the fact that they finally found out what was wrong with me was a huge weight off my shoulders.
While Dr. Notarianni can't know for sure, he suspects that the disease started with a structural abnormality in Jessica's heart that she was never aware of.
On the transesophageal echocardiogram that was performed on Jessica, we did see mitral valve prolapse as part of her findings, and so she probably did have that before the infection started.
And once the infection entered her bloodstream and latched onto the valve, Jessica's immune system went into overdrive.
Your body's mechanisms for fighting infection include fevers. Raising the temperature is one way of killing off infections. Headaches would accompany that because of the body's attempt to fight the infection that's there.
While doctors tried to keep her symptoms in check with antibiotics, they only helped so much because they couldn't get to the source of her infection, the vegetation on her valve.
The clot also blocks blood flow to the center of the bacteria, and you need blood flow in order to get the antibodies in to kill off the bacteria.
Eventually, her infection escalated and became so severe that Jessica became dangerously septic.
The infection spread throughout the entire body.
And to make matters worse, as the bacterial growth on her heart mushroomed, it began tearing her mitral valve apart.
A torn valve in your heart leads to increased pressures in the top chamber of your heart, which can then force more pressure into your lungs and lead to complications. If Jessica's condition had not been eventually diagnosed, she would have developed congestive heart failure. She would then not have been able to breathe, and eventually her heart would have stopped.
I feel like I'm the luckiest person ever, because if they didn't find out when they did, I would have died.
With a massive growth of bacteria threatening to shut her heart down, it's imperative that Dr. Notarianni operate as soon as possible.
While prolonged antibiotics might be able to cure her infection, because of the size of her vegetation, it would need to be cut out. And because the valve was torn, it would need to be surgically repaired.
I never thought I would ever be 30 years old and have to go through open heart surgery. It was insane.
Unfortunately, the medical team can't perform the complicated surgery until they deal with an even more pressing issue, the sepsis that's flooding Jessica's bloodstream.
It is dangerous to operate on somebody who is septic. Their body is fighting the infection. It doesn't have the ability to recover as easily.
They couldn't perform the surgery right away because she had bacteria all throughout her system, and they needed to eliminate that before they did open heart surgery.
In a race against time, Dr. Notarianni immediately doubles Jessica's dose of antibiotics, hoping to eliminate the infection before her valve literally blows out.
To be told that your body is a ticking time bomb, that your body is essentially working against itself, it scared the hell out of me.
I was absolutely terrified. It's just an awful feeling knowing that at any moment she could lose her life.
Over the past year, a mysterious muscle weakness has been wreaking havoc on David Skinner's life. It's forced him to rely on a walker and a wheelchair to get around. Now, suddenly, he's collapsed onto the floor, completely paralyzed.
I couldn't move anything. I was very worried. I didn't know if I was gonna die.
When I saw him on the floor, it really scared me because my mom wasn't there. That is when I was sure that he would pretty much never walk.
I picked up the phone and I called my mom and I told her to come home immediately.
I raced in the door, saw him on the ground, and called 911.
So the ambulance came, got me on a stretcher, got me to the hospital as soon as possible. When we arrive at the ER, the doctor tries to do the neurological workup on me. He asks me to push my foot like I'm pushing a gas pedal, and I don't move at all. He wanted to do a muscle biopsy the next day. The muscle biopsy would show damage within the muscles that could be causing my weakness.
The doctor admits David, and the test is scheduled for the next day.
But the following morning, surprisingly, I was able to stand and get up out of bed and walk a little bit. I was dumbfounded. It didn't make sense to me. And they decided not to do the muscle biopsy.
The doctors released him and said, "We don't know what it is, but it's gone. If it happens again, bring him back in immediately."
I decided the doctors aren't going to help me. I'm going to have to help myself. So I started searching on the internet. I came across the Neuromuscular Rehab Institute in Rochester, New York. I learned that they do research into lots of neurological and neuromuscular conditions. I immediately got on the phone, made an appointment, and a week later, Janice and I were on the plane to meet Dr. Chad Heatwole.
When I first met David, he told me about how his symptoms would come and go, but he would explain how these events could last between hours, even up to multiple days, and then resolve, which is a little bit peculiar. David and his family were frustrated, and they certainly had been through a lot up until that point.
As we were talking, he actually listened. I never felt like I got that from any other doctor.
So after reviewing his chart and doing a physical examination, I wanted to see how his strength was. I had David walk up and down the hallway, and what I noticed at about 20 meters, his gait started to change. Most people have a very narrow-based gait. David's became wider. I certainly had a hunch about what could have caused his symptoms.
So he did a blood test to confirm the results.
Specifically, we were looking for a genetic mutation.
The next 3 weeks go by with agonizing slowness as David waits for the results.
We couldn't help but think about it and wonder and hope that we were going to get an answer.
After 3 weeks, we were able to provide him with the diagnosis of hyperkalemic periodic paralysis.
Hyperkalemic periodic paralysis is a genetic disorder affecting muscular control. In healthy individuals, sodium flows into muscle cells, triggering potassium to flow out. That loop, sodium in, potassium out, creates an electrical charge which activates the muscle. But in patients like David, the channel that sodium flows through doesn't close. As a result, the loop is interrupted and the muscles are paralyzed.
The sodium and the potassium regulate the excitability of the muscle so that the muscle can fire. David is not able to properly regulate the flow of potassium and sodium in and out of the cell. In a normal person, the door opens for the sodium to come into the cell and the potassium to go out. With patients with a mutated gene, this door cannot shut and the muscle cannot contract. Then paralysis ensues.
Strange to say, but we were really relieved and excited that they finally have some answer.
While doctors know that hyperkalemic periodic paralysis is caused by a defective gene, they don't know what set off the disease.
It's very complicated, and we're still learning more about this disease. Typically, symptoms occur in the first decade or second decade of life. However, David's symptoms were later than most, which certainly is a mystery in his case.
We had lived for a long time knowing that it wasn't stress. We finally got a diagnosis, and now I really needed to know what this is going to do for my future. Am I ever going to be able to walk again? Am I going to die?
Jessica Blazak has just learned that a bacterial growth on her heart valve has been damaging her heart and poisoning her bloodstream over the past 3 months. Now, she's undergoing a course of antibiotics to combat the lethal infection so that surgeons can operate. But at any given moment, her valve could collapse.
After 3 days of being on the antibiotics, Jessica was finally cleared for the surgery.
I was very scared something would go wrong and I would never wake up from this kind of surgery.
I felt very helpless when she was being wheeled into surgery. At that point, there's nothing that I could do. It's all in the hands of the doctors. You know, pray for the best.
Once the surgeons gain access to the heart valve itself, the mass is actually just cut out with a scalpel. And then the mitral valve was sutured back together again.
After 6 grueling hours, the surgeon pronounces the operation a success.
They were able to remove the bacteria to save her valve. It was a huge relief knowing that the surgery went well.
When I woke up, I was fine. Thank God.
Jessica was able to go home about a week after the surgery.
I had to be on antibiotics for a month to make sure that all of the bacteria was out of my system.
Jessica's prognosis now is excellent. She's recovered completely from the surgery.
I didn't sustain any lasting damage. My heart is completely back to normal.
Thrilled as she is to be alive and healthy, Jessica can't help but wonder why it took so long to get a solid diagnosis.
In retrospect, endocarditis is something that is detectable. It's very frustrating to think about how come so many experts miss the diagnosis. I had all the textbook signs of endocarditis, but nobody noticed.
She is very atypical in that she did not have any of the usual risk factors that we knew of. Diagnosing endocarditis is tricky because of the presentation. Fevers can be caused by lots of different things.
I don't think it's anybody's fault. I just think that I'm lucky to be here. And I appreciate the fact that somebody found it.
After more than a year, David Skinner has finally learned what's been causing his crippling muscle weakness: hyperkalemic periodic paralysis. Now, he's about to find out if he'll ever walk on his own again.
One of the things that we've seen in hyperkalemic periodic paralysis is exercise triggering events. Any type of exercise can initially cause an elevation in potassium in the blood, which can trigger the paralytic attack.
Finally, all my symptoms made sense. Every time I would exercise, I would get weaker. I've always had the mutation, but something had to trigger the mutation, so it might have been doing the yard work because that's when the symptoms started.
Then, during David's first hospital stay, while he rested in bed, his body was able to restore the balance between potassium and sodium.
Eventually, the kidney is able to catch up and filter some of the potassium out and return the membranes to a normal state and allow the patient to recover and regain strength. But the physical therapy was not a good idea for him, as the exercise triggered his attacks.
When I was thinking back on the physical therapy, I got angry and frustrated because I did what the doctor said. What they wanted me to do was making me worse.
And over the next year, David was trapped in a vicious cycle.
The more I sat and relaxed, the more the potassium in my body would change enough so that my muscles would become stronger again. So some days I would be able to use the walker, but again, if I overdid it physically, then I would have to use a wheelchair.
In fact, had the disease progressed any further, it could have proven fatal.
Without a correct diagnosis, it probably would have only been a matter of time before he would have had another significant, prolonged paralytic attack. The diaphragmatic muscles can be involved and cause respiratory failure.
When he had his full body paralysis, if it affected his breathing, it could have closed off, and that absolutely would have been life-threatening.
I didn't realize how much danger I was in if I had another full body episode. I was scared.
There currently is not a cure for hyperkalemic periodic paralysis, but there are therapies that are actually quite good at minimizing the chance that attacks occur frequently and decreasing the severity of the attacks. We recommended that he take glucose tablets whenever he felt weakness, as glucose can reduce potassium levels and help stave off an attack of paralysis. And he certainly needs to maintain minimal amount of physical activity, as it could trigger his attacks.
The prognosis is I can live with this. It's not something we can fix. It's only something we can try to help control. There will be days that I will still get weak, but I should be able to live a normal life.
Though they're relieved to finally have a diagnosis, David and Janice can't understand why it took nearly 2 years to get one.
Hyperkalemic periodic paralysis is a rare, understudied, underdiagnosed condition. It's suspected that this occurs out of 200,000 people.
We are very grateful for Dr. Heatwald. He has really opened up a whole new world for us. It's like closing a chapter that you never want to go back to.
Today, Jessica is symptom-free and as active as ever.
She's back to living a very normal, healthy lifestyle, but she is definitely still at high risk for developing endocarditis again in the future. She needs to take antibiotic before she does any type of procedures that could possibly introduce bacteria back into her bloodstream.
I feel fantastic. I feel like I'm finally back to myself. It's been 3 years since the surgery, and I have a healthy heart.
She was extremely brave and courageous for everything that she went through, and I care about her very much.
I think you have to really listen to your body. If you feel sick, if you feel something is wrong, follow up with it, because it might be something serious. You might not be able to sleep it off. I'm just so unbelievably lucky. I thank God every day that I made it through, and I made it through healthy.
Today, David is coping with the limitations of his disease with optimism and courage.
We try to live life to its fullest. I do still have episodes of weakness, typically once a week, but not near as scary as it used to be. I have to be aware of the amount of physical activity. So before I go outside to shoot baskets, I'll take some glucose tablets, and that will keep me from having a weakened state. But I'm back to being able to walk around, to live a normal life. I feel much more like the dad I was and the husband I was before this whole ordeal ever started.
I'm really, really happy that we can finally have fun again and play, and it's really just a relief to know what he has.
Our family time is back together. It's just such a blessing.
I have learned that you don't take anything for granted, that everything that you're able to do, you should enjoy and embrace the experience. If you're having difficulty with the diagnosis, make sure the doctors are listening to you. There's doctors out there that will listen. Sometimes you have to work harder to find them.